Bill Walker's conviction for domestic abuse is a relief for his victims, but uncomfortable for Scottish politics. Questions are already being asked about the parliamentary rules which allow a serial offender to remain a sitting MSP. More importantly, perhaps, is the issue of how such a man became an elected representative in the first place.
Well, earlier this evening, that was the question we put to the First Minister earlier this evening. Alex Salmond couldn't have been more emphatic about his party's leadership role in the matter.
I knew nothing whatsoever about any of these charges, and neither did the SNP leadership. These charges have been determined in court. If we'd known about these charges, why on earth would he have got through a selection committee? The whole basis of the expulsion of Mr Walker was that he hadn't provided the information which every candidate is meant to do about relevant features in terms of his past.
Well, earlier this evening I spoke to Rob Armstrong. He's the brother-in-law of Bill Walker's third wife, Diana, and he approached the SNP about Walker as early as 2008. Did you warn the SNP that Bill Walker had a violent past?
Yes, I did.
How did you warn the SNP that Bill Walker had a violent past? Because they say a conversation was had, but it mainly focused on child access issues.
No, that's not correct. I, first of all, discussed the instances of violence of which I was personally aware. Also produced documentation which certainly illustrated the level of violence which he perpetrated towards various women, namely Mrs. Anne Walker, Diana Walker, and to a relative of mine who was a child at the time.
Could anyone who was involved in that conversation have emerged from it thinking that Bill Walker didn't have to face some pretty serious questions about his past?
Certainly not. The meeting which I had with Miss Hunter concluded with expressing her concern as she looked at the documentation. She also photocopied certain newspaper articles. She advised me that she would be passing this on to the executive and that I should expect to hear from someone from the executive in due course.
Did you hear from an executive member?
Not at all. I never heard anything further.
You talk about newspaper articles. Was there any hard evidence in the documentation you passed to the SNP?
Yes, there was. There was also the judgment from a Swindon court where a judge describes William George Walker as a tyrant and a bully. We also obtained a penal notice, a document which stated that if William George Walker perpetrated violence or chastisement towards a certain child, William George Walker, would be liable for prison.
All this was passed on to Nicola Sturgeon's office?
She looked at it, she studied it.
Nicola Sturgeon's assistant?
This was Nicola Sturgeon's assistant. She studied it, she expressed her concern, and as I say, the meeting concluded with photocopying the documentation and advising me that this information would be passed on and that I should expect to hear from the executive.
That was 2008. 2011, Bill Walker becomes an MSP.
Yes.
What did you think?
I certainly was very shocked, because I certainly had hoped that during this meeting that I had with Miss Hunter, that any further political aspirations that this man might have had would have been arrested there and then.
People may wonder, are you speaking as a member of another political party? Do you have an axe to grind against the SNP?
No, not at all. I respect Alex Salmond, and I am quite sure had he been aware of the information, the circumstances would have been considerably different.
To be absolutely clear, you believe you did your best to warn the SNP about Bill Walker?
Very much so, and in doing so, hoped that the people of Dunfermline would be made aware of the kind of individual that they had as a councillor, far less a member of the Scottish Parliament.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, no one from the SNP was available to be interviewed on this programme tonight, but the party has issued a statement in which they say Mr Armstrong's concerns were handed to headquarters by the staff member in Nicola Sturgeon's office, and that reasonable inquiries were made, but there was no evidence of any complaint in law or legal proceedings into Mr Walker's conduct, and that the inquiry was closed. Well, I'm joined now from Edinburgh by the investigations editor of the Sunday Herald, Paul Hutchin, who broke this story, and with me here in Glasgow is Labour's Claire Baker. Thank you both very much indeed for joining us. Paul Hutchin, do you believe the SNP could have done more to investigate the complaints we've heard about this evening?
Absolutely. I do accept First Minister Alex Salmond's view that he knew nothing about it. And all the time I've worked on this story, it's never been suggested to me that he personally had prior knowledge. But what is absolutely certain is that Rob Armstrong had a meeting with Nicola Sturgeon's parliamentary assistant and passed on some information about Bill Walker's violent past. And that information was then passed on to SNP headquarters. Now, I've got some of the information that was given to Nicola Sturgeon's parliamentary assistant. For instance, there's a newspaper article from 1991, and in the first paragraph of that article, it states that Bill Walker admitted hitting his daughter over the head with the saucepan. Now, if that information was then given to SNP headquarters, I think at the very least, Bill Walker should have been asked about this allegation, certainly when he applied to be a candidate for Holyrood.
The SNP say that this information was passed on to headquarters. It was looked at. They established from their view that there were no legal complaints against Bill Walker. That's fair enough, isn't it? Because if you have an allegation made but there's no very clear evidence suggesting somebody is guilty of something, it would be unfair on that person if you were to take any sanctions against them.
Well, I'm not going to dispute that this information was looked into. I think my complaint is that Mr Walker wasn't interviewed about it. There's a big difference between being a councillor and MSP, and if you want to be a legislator in the Scottish Parliament, you should be asked some difficult questions about serious issues in your past.
Why do you think he wasn't asked?
I think that the SNP didn't expect to win the Dunfermline seat. It wasn't a priority. He was a bit of a journeyman candidate, wasn't really taken seriously, and they probably had their priorities lying elsewhere.
Claire Baker, your party has said the SNP has some serious questions to answer about what they knew. What are those questions?
I mean, I think it is Beggar's belief that, as Mr Armstrong said, he raised these concerns in Nicola Sturgeon's office, the deputy leader of the SNP, and that these were then passed to headquarters, but there seems to have been very little robust action taking place, so little action taking place that Bill Walker is then selected to be a candidate 3 years down the line and is seen as a fit person to stand in Dunfermline and become elected to that constituency. I think they have questions to answer around how was this investigated and who knew the information that was being raised with them.
But they're very clear that they had a look at the information that was available to them. There was nothing that would clearly disbar Mr Walker from standing as a candidate, and therefore in the interests of natural justice, the SNP acted appropriately, didn't they?
But they haven't said if they directly asked Mr Walker about the allegations, if there was any questions asked around his selection procedure and how that was interrogated. There have not been clear
But before you become an SNP candidate,
evidence.
You were asked whether there's any information which may embarrass the party or which may affect your selection as a candidate. The SNP are quite clear. Mr Walker didn't give them the information.
I think the way that Mr Walker has behaved through this trial suggests that he is a fairly arrogant man, and he has still not came out and apologised or recognised the actions that he has done.
So doesn't the responsibility lie squarely with Bill Walker rather than the SNP?
No, I don't think you could expect Bill Walker to write on his application to be an MSP that he has been involved in domestic abuse for generations. I think it is up to political parties. It's never an easy situation for political parties to deal with, and there will always be difficulties in trying to select candidates. But I think parties need to be very robust in their procedures, and I think there's evidence that the SNP have since changed their procedures, which suggests maybe there are questions to ask around how they treated this situation.
Robert Armstrong also told us, although it's not in that interview, that he approached the Labour Party. He went to John Smith House in Glasgow at the HQ, got as far as reception and got no further to try and pass on the information to the Labour Party. You all have questions to answer.
Well, I'm not aware of those concerns that Mr Armstrong I'm not aware that he has been in touch with the Labour Party, but we would take those kind of allegations very seriously. And I think if you look at the Labour Party's record, when there have been problems with candidates or with existing members, that we acted quite quickly. The issue here today is that in 2008, the SNP were made aware of concerns around Mr Walker's behaviour, and no action was taken, so little action was taken, that the man was then selected to be the candidate for Dunfermline and since became an MSP.
Paul Hutchin, the SNP say they have looked again at their procedures and they will take into account information which may not have led to any convictions when they're trying to assess their candidates. People at home may be thinking, look, this is a man who could potentially be sentenced now to 12 months but continue on as an MSP. How likely is it, do you think, that he'll carry on until 2016 drawing the salary of more than £50,000 a year?
Well, anyone who knows Bill Walker knows that he is money mad, and the idea that he's going to walk away from a 56 grand a year salary is just fantasy land. I think he's going to hang on to the bitter end because he knows he's not going to get employed elsewhere, and I think he's going to be a really bad smell in the Parliament until they clear up this mess. Claire Beckett, very quickly, will he go? Should he go?
Everyone thinks he should go. The only person that doesn't seem to think he should go is Bill Walker. But he definitely should go. Dunfermline deserves a better representative than Bill Walker.
OK, thank you both very much indeed for joining us this evening. Now,